WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange turned 50 over the weekend. Many people took to Twitter emphasizing that he celebrated his birthday in prison and called for the charges against him to be dropped.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald joins us now to weigh in on the Assange case. Welcome, Glenn.
Hello, Ryan. How are you? Good to be with you guys.
Well done.
You deserve
that. Well done.
That.
You got that. I did. So when do you think the media is going to start paying attention to this case, if ever?
I don't think they likely are going to start paying attention to this case, in large part because they don't regard Julian Assange as being part of their club and therefore don't understand or don't care about the grave press freedoms posed by this indictment and the precedent that it could set that could allow them and their own work to be criminalized. They spent 5 years very flamboyantly feigning concern about assaults on press freedom, by which they meant that Trump would say something insulting to Jim Acosta or post some adolescent tweet about Wolf Blitzer and Chuck Todd. But in the meantime, right under their noses, you had the gravest threat to press freedom by far during the Trump years, which was the unsealed indictment of Julian Assange. And there were a few of them during the Trump years that would talk about it in passing because it enabled them to demonize Trump. It was something that enabled them to say, look what Trump's doing. This is a grave danger to press freedom. Now that Trump is gone and it's the Biden administration actively pursuing the prosecution. In fact, it was the Biden Justice Department that appealed the judge's refusal to extradite Assange, which is what's keeping him in prison. They're now almost entirely silent because they don't want to defend Assange, because they don't see him as a real journalist like they are. And they also don't want to criticize the Biden administration for attacking press freedom because it would force them to admit that the only real attack on press freedom during the Trump years is one that they largely ignored, which was this prosecution.
This is such an interesting point. And Glenn, you tweeted Julian Assange, responsible for breaking more major stories than his journalist critics combined, turns 50 today in prison. He's in prison for one reason. The Biden administration and most of the corporate press don't care about press freedoms, but only pretend to care when convenient. So my question for you is, what explains this disconnect? Because that is, when Trump touched something, it immediately, like, the press would do the opposite of it. That was their signal to, like, suddenly do the opposite. Biden comes into office. There's still basically crickets when it comes to Assange. Is it the gatekeeper point that you just mentioned that makes the media sort of turn a blind eye to the Assange case as it plays out? Is it because they see themselves as the gatekeepers and they see him as just sort of this unruly rascal that's breaking all of the rules that govern their hallowed profession? Like, what is the disconnect? What explains it?
You know, it's interesting. I think people have forgotten the history here, which is that the Obama Justice Department in 2010, which is when WikiLeaks published their most consequential leaks from Chelsea Manning of the Iraq war logs, the Afghanistan war logs, and the one that bothered the U.S. government most, which was the leak of the diplomatic cables. They really wanted to prosecute Assange and WikiLeaks for having done that. They were furious. I mean, Hillary Clinton regarded this as like the worst crime in decades to the State Department, and everyone up and down the government hated Assange so much for that. And they convened a grand jury, they criminally investigated, they made it clear to the press they wanted to prosecute him, and that they were looking for some way to be able to say, because the question was, how can you prosecute Assange for publishing these classified materials from Chelsea Manning when he did so in partnership with the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, other journals, other media outlets throughout the world? How do you justify prosecuting Assange for that, but not any of those media outlets that did the same thing? And they said, we're looking for something that we can be able to say shows that Assange did something more than just passively receive the information and then publish it. He actually cooperated or collaborated in the illegal obtaining of the documents themselves. And they ultimately concluded, we looked high and low, we couldn't find anything, and they didn't indict him. That was the Obama Justice Department's conclusion, was we can't indict him without endangering press freedom. Mike Pompeo and Jeff Sessions come in, and Mike Pompeo, when he was a CIA director, gave a speech to the CIA saying our priority is to destroy WikiLeaks. They keep claiming that they have the First Amendment protections, but we don't think they do, and that ends now. So the indictment of Assange was something the Obama Justice Department regarded as dangerous, and the Trump Justice Department and Mike Pompeo and Jeff Sessions were the ones actually behind. So you would think that liberals, just based on that kind of reflexive framework, would be opposed to it, and especially journalists as well. And the reason they're not is absolutely professional jealousy. It's the fact that, as I said in that tweet, Assange has broken more major stories than all of them combined, and he did so without having kind of one foot in their club. You know, it's interesting. I'm not exactly universally beloved among corporate media employees, and yet when I was being threatened with imprisonment during the Snowden reporting, when David Gregory suggested that I be in jail, and then in 2020 when I was actually criminally indicted by the Bolsonaro government for my reporting, based on a very similar theory to the one they're using against Assange, almost all of the media manifested in my defense. Why? Because unlike Assange, I actually had one foot always in the media world. I was doing the Snowden reporting with The Guardian. I then was part of The Intercept. But Assange is just such an outsider that they have so much resentment and jealousy toward him that they would rather prioritize their personality preferences and allow him to go to prison and create a precedent that endangers all the work that they do than take a stand for him. And just one last point, which is I think always lost in this case, is that press freedom, you know, when you say, oh, press freedom is in danger, so many liberals all the time respond with, well, no, it's not, because Assange is not a journalist. Press freedom in the Constitution, like every other right in the Bill of Rights, is not confined to one tiny group of like this credentialed priesthood called journalists. Because otherwise, who decides who's a journalist and not? It's a right that all citizens possess to use the press to inform your fellow citizens about what the government is doing. It's a right that pertains to everybody, not just to whatever you want to call a journalist.
Now that this has become bipartisan, with the Biden administration endorsing this prosecution, have you noticed any fallout in Brazil or among colleagues that you have around the world with authoritarians saying, look, Biden has Assange in prison, so therefore, you know, we can turn the screw just a little bit tighter ourselves?
Well, you know, it's so interesting, Ryan, because about a month before I was contacted by my Brazil source in 2019 that ultimately led to the Bolsonaro government trying to indict me, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about why the Assange indictment was such a grave threat to all journalists working all over the world. And what I said was, it's an attempt to criminalize the normal relationship between a journalist and their source, and ultimately will be used by repressive governments as a model. And little did I know that a month later, I got contacted by my own source. And then 8 months later, the Bolsonaro government, when they tried to indict me, used that as the model. And I'm sure a big part of why they thought they could get away with prosecuting me was because they looked at what the U.S. government was doing to Assange and said, well, how can anybody object when the U.S. government, the leader of the free world, is doing that to Assange? We can take the same theory and apply it to him. Absolutely, this is going to inspire attacks on journalists all over the world if it succeeds. And it already has succeeded. Julian Assange has been essentially locked up for the last 10 years, 8 years because he had to seek asylum from Ecuador in order to avoid being extradited to Sweden, which was going to extradite him to the United States. And now another 2 years in a high security prison in the UK that's used for terrorists without ever once being convicted of a crime. So it has already worked and definitely will inspire similar attacks.
What role has sort of neutered public opinion when it comes to this played? Because, and we talked to Julian Assange's brother earlier today, and Ryan laid all of this out in a really good monologue and a really good radar. This is a thin indictment. Is obviously a thin indictment because they are continuing to try to get around the problem, the New York Times problem. And when you have that, they went on this tour of the United States talking to people, trying to basically galvanize public opinion. Assange's family did. And I wonder, if there were more pressure, if the media were more responsive to an outraged populace, and if the media was more upset on Assange's behalf and on their own behalf based on the potential consequences of this indictment, would that not create a situation that's almost untenable for the Biden administration if the press were really outraged about this and the public was really outraged about this?
Yeah, but, yes. But here's the thing. Here's the key point. And I think the most disturbing point is, as I mentioned earlier, the Obama Justice Department concluded that Assange can't be prosecuted. Most media outlets at the time, even before that announcement was made, was saying, we hate Julian Assange as much as anybody, but we don't think he should be indicted or prosecuted because it's too dangerous. The only thing that has changed The only thing that has changed between 2010, when there was a media consensus against this, and now when there's kind of like an acquiescence, if not outright support, is that in 2016, Julian Assange was perceived to have done reporting that helped Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. And that is the only thing that has changed, is that it converted, when I was defending WikiLeaks back in 2010, it was common on the right to hate national security leaks. They hated Daniel Ellsberg. They hated Julian Assange. It was more like a left-wing cause to leak the secret documents of the U.S. security state. What has happened is he lost his entire support among Democrats as well because of his perceived role in the 2016 election. So in a lot of ways, he's being imprisoned because his reporting hurt the Democratic Party. That's why the Biden administration is so intent on prosecuting him, because they hate Assange, not for what he did in 2010, but for what he did in 2016. The other point is, you're right, the indictment is so thin, and in the last 2 weeks, it got a lot thinner. One of the main witnesses on whom the FBI relied is this convicted sex offender and diagnosed sociopath and compulsive liar from Iceland, who recanted one of his main allegations that the FBI used to indict Assange, namely that Assange directed him to hack into the emails of a variety of officials in Iceland. So the indictment, as thin as it already was, got a lot more discredited. The media completely ignored that news. You can't find any reporting that one of the main FBI witnesses against Assange recanted, which shows you how hostile they are to Assange's defense. And you have civil liberties groups and press freedom groups more or less in unison saying they're against this prosecution, but only a very few of them are actually prioritizing it. Like the ACLU will sign a letter if you force them to, but they don't really care. So that's the problem, is Assange is a person without a political home. He already lost the support of people on the right from 2010. And then with his work in 2016, publishing, the emails of John Podesta and the DNC that did hurt Hillary Clinton's candidacy, probably, he lost the support of Democrats as well. And so he has no one to rally around him. It's really journalists who should be doing it. But because journalists are like the Democrats, seeing the world exclusively through Trump, all they know about Assange is that he helped Trump and therefore he's a bad person. They can't get past that.
This is such an interesting statement because the ACLU has just lost all of its moral credibility, and it really has been the premier outside group that would set these standards and would have authority on freedom of speech and freedom of press. But when you erode your moral credibility because of polarization in the same way that a lot of people in the press have done it, we lose our most important nonprofit weapons to combat these things.
Yeah, and I think it's an unavoidable conclusion that Assange lost his cultural and political protection from Democrats because Democrats blamed him for Trump taking office. His only hope at that point was that Trump would drop the charges or pardon or commute or whatever, which I think might have happened if November, December, and January had unfolded differently. Instead, Trump had other priorities and felt kind of under siege after January 6th, and I think wasn't willing at that point to take any risks. Trump is only going to do something that advantages him, and he would have loved, I think, to troll Democrats by dropping the charges or by pardoning Assange. But once he was starting to feel some post January 6th heat, if it was going to cost him 5 minutes of misery, he's not going to do it.
Right. No, I think that's true. Glenn, thank you so much for your time today.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Well, we'll have more Rising for you coming up, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our new content.